Hi, I'm Jonah Weeks. I am a PhD student at UC-Davis, and I'm excited to be here today with you all talking about plant diversity response to fire severity in Sierra Nevada yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. So let's start with some background on this system. So pre-European American settlement, these areas were characterized by frequent low severity fire. So by frequent, I mean about every 5 to 15 years these areas were burning. And by low severity, I mean very little overstory tree mortality was occurring with these fires. So you can tell that there's a really distinct understory layer on this photo on the right, which is what these forests historically looked like. So this distinct understory layer, and the fire would kind of burn through and kill some sick trees or unhealthy trees or saplings, but the majority of the canopy remained intact post-fire. Currently, these forests look a lot more like this photo on the right due to the removal of Native American people who were actively managing these lands by burning them for thousands of years. And then also intentional fire suppression that started around the turn of the 20th century. So due to those things, now we see these forests that are far more dense, and they also have a lot of fuel continuity. So very little gaps between ground fuels and canopy fuels. So you can imagine that if fire entered these forests, the results might look a little different. So the historical forests, you would see very little structural change pre and post fire. And those forests would recover quite quickly to looking essentially how they did pre-fire. Currently, if you have fire enter these really dense forests now, you get something like this photo on the right. So post-fire, you have very little overstory trees that survive the fire. So this is a picture of a large area of high severity. So you can tell that the pre and post-fire landscape look super different in this instance. So we know that fire regimes are changing, that the frequency of high severity has increased, the area burned by high severity fire is increasing, and that climate change may exacerbate these trends and is already exacerbating these trends. So due to longer, hotter, drier summers and more anomalous weather, there's more chance for these large high severity fires to occur, which impacts a whole host of ecosystem characteristics, but the one we're focused on today is plant diversity. So why do we care about plant diversity? We know that plant diversity can contribute to nutrient cycling, erosion. We know that plants are resources for wildlife and can also affect the hydrologic system of an area as well. So what are our guiding questions? Number one, we want to look at how plant diversity varies along the fire severity spectrum. Number two, how does homogeneity in communities change across fire severity classes? And number three, how does the temporal gradient affect these patterns? So for the first part, for the across space portion of this, we're going to be looking at a study conducted by my colleague Clark Richter. And we looked at 8 fires across California. And at the time of data collection, they were all between 5 and 14 years post-fire. And then one of those fires that is in Clark Richter's data set was also sampled sampled multiple times across the first decade post-fire. So that's the Angora fire. So that's the across time portion of this. So when we're talking about fire severity, I already mentioned that we're talking about overstory tree mortality. So here's a rundown of these fire severity classes, which I will continue to mention what that overstory tree mortality loss is. But yeah, it runs from the unburned class with no overstory tree mortality to this very high fire severity class of over 90% of the overstory trees were killed in the fire. So we had our sampling, plot selection and setup was conducted by using remote sensing data to disperse our plots across as evenly as possible across the fire severity spectrum. And then we ground truthed once crews got to these plots. So if for some reason it didn't match up with the remote sense data, that was corrected. And then at each plot, we used the common stand exam protocol, and the vegetative portion of that is conducted on a 400 square meter circular plot. And within that plot, a complete vegetative census was conducted. So every species that was there was marked down, and then ocular estimates were done to assess the percent cover of each species within that plot. So how does plant diversity vary along the fire severity spectrum? To assess alpha diversity or local plot level diversity, we used the Shannon index. So you can see that there's essentially a unimodal response of diversity to fire severity. So you get that kind of hump-shaped response. And you see the highest diversity at this moderate severity class. So that class 3, again, is 50 to 75% overstory mortality loss, but there's no statistical difference between that and class 2 as well, which is the 25 to 50%. So those, again, those lower severities were far more common historically. And then you see that you have much lower diversity at those high and very high fire severity classes, which is a common theme that these high and very high severity classes kind of cluster away from the other fire severity classes. So question number 2, how similar are plant communities across fire severity classes? Let's first talk about what beta diversity is, or what this dissimilarity is. So when we're trying to look at heterogeneity of an area, we're using beta diversity as to look at this. So you have really low beta diversity when you have low species turnover between plots. So if you have 2 plots that have the same species and the same amount of those species, you would have really, really low beta diversity in that class, as opposed to 2 plots that had completely different species. So 100% turnover, you would have really high beta diversity there. So some of these classes have been clustered here. You generally see a decreasing trend of beta diversity as you increase in fire severity class. So you see it's essentially a homogenization of those areas. So you see way less species turnover amongst all of the high severity classes than you do in the lower and unburned areas. And that could lead to like regional level biodiversity loss with, you just essentially see the same species over and over and over in those high severity areas. So yeah, plots are more similar to one another with increasing fire severity. And then next we want to look at what happens to these patterns over time. So this photo series just kind of gives you an idea of what's happening. The top row is 1 year post-fire, the bottom row is 9 years post-fire. And you could tell that with increasing fire severity, you see a distinct visual difference between these classes through time. And you can tell that there's an increasing dominance of shrubs as you increase in severity as well. But what does that look like when we actually look at the diversity? So this is a model that we used. We used all the years of data to inform the model's predictions. And you see a generally unimodal response, again, of diversity to severity, again, using Shannon's index as our alpha diversity measure. And minus the unburned area that's a little bit higher than expected, you see very little change in this low and low moderate severities as time goes on. So In general, they increase. The blue is 1 year post-fire and the red is 9 years post-fire. So at fire severity classes 1 and 2, through time, the diversity increases. And then at that moderate severity, you see a decrease, but not super significant. And then when you get to the high and very high severity classes, you see a distinct decrease in diversity through time. So again, it seems like something different is happening in those high and very high severity classes. Loss of biodiversity through time. So not only does that pattern persist over time, but it intensifies as well. And then looking at beta diversity, you see no real distinct pattern to fire severity in 1 and 3 years post-fire. You see a general unimodal response 5 years post-fire. And then when you get to 8 and 9 years post-fire, there's very little difference between the unburned and low severity classes. But when you get to that high and very high severity, again, you see a decrease through time. So as time goes on, you see less and less turnover in those plots. For this analysis, 1 refers to the 1 and 2 categories have been combined. So this is a little bit different, but the 3 and 4, those final 2 categories are still referring to the high and very high severity. So again, this trend leading to more homogenization of those high severity areas. So our conclusions, local diversity peaks at moderate fire severity, which isn't super surprising because those moderate and low severities are more common historically, and you can imagine that more species in those areas are adapted to those post-fire conditions, and you see that low diversity at very high severity, which makes sense that there's not that many species that are adapted to very high fire severity. So high fire severity is also driving homogenization in plant communities. So again, that beta diversity decreases as fire severity increases. So that could lead us to think that more high severity fire leads to more biodiversity loss, especially in these huge fires that cover really large areas of the landscape, in which it's one big patch of high severity fire, which is becoming increasingly more common. And then over time, high severity areas show a greater decrease in local diversity and heterogeneity. So again, this could be indicating that we could see biodiversity loss at these high and very high severity burned areas, and also that low and moderate severity areas might be on a different trajectory than high and very high severity areas, because that relationship persists through time. The caveat being that these systems aren't static, obviously, and they could eventually recover, but we also know that repeated burns are common. So with repeated burning, they might stay on those separate trajectories for a longer duration of time. Yeah, so thank you all for your time, and thank you. And here are my acknowledgements and funding. Thanks.